Imagine trying to find your great-great-grandfather in American records. You start where most people start, with the most recent documentation you can find. You search the 1900 census. His name appears. The record is there, clear and readable. His address, his occupation, his family members listed beside him. It feels straightforward, so you go further back. You search the 1880 census. He appears again. Same process, same result. The record exists, and it tells you something about who he was and where he lived. At this point, the research feels normal, methodical, the kind of work that genealogists and historians do every day without expecting anything unusual. But then you try to find him in 1890, and something is different. The search returns nothing, not a partial result, not a damaged record with missing fields, nothing at all. And at first, you assume the problem is with your search. Maybe the name is spelled differently. Maybe the record is filed under a variation. So you try again. You adjust the spelling. You search nearby counties. You cross-reference with other documents from the same period. And still nothing. Not because your great-great-grandfather wasn't living in America in 1890. Not because he was somehow missed by the census takers who went door to door across the entire country, but because the record that documented his existence during that year simply no longer exists. This is not a rare experience. Genealogists encounter this wall constantly. Researchers who specialize in American family history describe it in almost identical terms. A gap that appears at a very specific moment in time. You can find people before it. You can find people after it. But for the year 1890, the documentation is almost entirely absent. And when you begin to look at why, the explanation that comes back is always the same. A fire, an accident, a loss. The kind of thing that happens sometimes with old records, and there's nothing more to examine. That is the version most people accept and move on from. On June 1st, 1890, the United States Census Bureau completed one of the most detailed population surveys in the country's history. Nearly 63 million Americans were documented that day. Their names were recorded. Their addresses were written down. Their occupations, their family structures, the composition of their households. All of it was carefully noted by census enumerators who traveled across the country, knocked on doors, and filled out individual schedules for each family they encountered. This was not a simple head count. The 1890 census was designed to capture a level of detail that no previous census had attempted. The people who designed it understood that America was changing rapidly, and they wanted to document exactly who was present at this particular moment. And for a time, those records existed. They were transported to Washington. They were cataloged. They became part of the federal government's official documentation of who lived in the United States in 1890. For years, they sat in storage as government records do, preserved, accessible in theory, a permanent part of the National Archive. This raises a question that seems almost too basic to ask. If the records were created, transported, and stored, then what happened to them? Where did 63 million individual documents go? The official answer is that they were destroyed. First by fire, then by water damage, and finally by a formal government authorization that turned what remained into discarded material. Today, only 6,160 names from that entire census survive in any accessible form. That is fragments from 10 states and the District of Columbia. Everything else is gone. To put that number in perspective, 6,160 names out of nearly 63 million documented individuals. That is less than 0.01% of the original record. If you try to find your ancestor in those surviving fragments, the probability of locating them is so small that it barely functions as a realistic possibility. For most families, the 1890 census simply does not exist. The people who were documented are undocumented again, as if the census takers never came to their doors, as if the June 1st count never happened. There is a kind of historical erasure in that number that is difficult to fully absorb. And this is where the official explanation, simple as it sounds, begins to feel insufficient. The official explanation is this. A fire broke out in the Commerce Building in Washington, D.C. on January 10, 1921. The 1890 census records, stored in the basement, were damaged. Some were destroyed by flames. Others were damaged by the water used to extinguish the fire. The remaining records deteriorated over the following years and were eventually authorized for destruction in 1933. By 1934, they were gone. That is the complete official account. And on its surface, it sounds like the kind of thing that happens. Buildings catch fire. Records are damaged. Institutions fail to act quickly enough to save what could have been saved. These are real things that happen in the real world, and blaming negligence feels reasonable. But this is where it becomes unclear, because when you examine the specific details of how the 1890 census was stored before the fire, not after, before, the picture becomes more complicated. The Commerce Building basement contained a fireproof vault. This is a documented fact, not a disputed detail. Inside that vault, census records were stored for protection. The 1880 census was inside the vault. The 1900 census was inside the vault. The 1910 census was inside the vault. 3 separate census years, representing tens of millions of individual records, were given the protection of a fireproof storage structure. They survived the 1921 fire without significant damage. And then there was the 1890 census, stored outside the vault, on open pine shelving, in an unlocked file room located directly adjacent to the boiler room, next to a carpenter's workshop containing sawdust and wood shavings. That detail sounds minor at first, until it is examined more closely. The institution that stored the 1890 census clearly understood how to protect records from fire. It demonstrated that understanding by placing every surrounding census inside a fireproof vault. The decision to store 1890 differently was not the result of not knowing how to protect records. The storage system existed. It was used. It just was not used for this particular year. And no official explanation has ever clearly accounted for why. Some suggest it was administrative oversight, that the records were placed incorrectly, and no one noticed or corrected it before the fire. But that explanation assumes a level of carelessness that is difficult to accept when the same institution was clearly capable of proper storage, and had demonstrated that capability for every other census in the same building. At first, it seems normal, but there is a problem. When the fire was extinguished on the evening of January 10th, the response of the people responsible for those records was unusual. After the flames were put out, the chief clerk opened windows to clear smoke from the building, and then, with waterlogged records sitting in ankle-deep water in the basement, almost everyone went home. There was no emergency salvage operation launched that night. No archivists were called in. No urgent effort was made to begin recovering the records that were still physically present, but soaking in the water that had been used to fight the fire. The decision was made effectively to leave the records until the following morning. This raises questions about what the priorities were in that moment. A significant portion of the records had survived the fire itself. Water damage to paper is serious, but it is not always fatal, particularly if recovery begins quickly. Professional archivists understand that wet records can often be dried, stabilized, and preserved if the process begins within hours. Leaving waterlogged documents sitting overnight is one of the most damaging decisions that can be made in a record emergency. And yet that is what happened. The morning after the fire, workers described finding ankle-deep water covering records across large sections of the basement storage area. The window for rapid recovery had already closed. What followed was 12 years of slow deterioration. The surviving records, and at least one contemporary assessment suggested approximately 38% were undamaged by the fire itself, were moved from location to location, from the Commerce Building to a temporary warehouse, then moved again. All the while, organizations that understood what was being lost were writing letters and filing formal requests. The National Genealogical Society petitioned Congress. The Daughters of the American Revolution submitted formal protests. Historians wrote directly to government officials asking for preservation funding. All of them received the same response: assurances that the records were being maintained, that no destruction was planned, that the situation was being handled. For 12 years, those assurances continued, and then the situation changed entirely. In 1932, the Census Bureau reviewed its holdings and prepared a list of records deemed no longer necessary. The 1890 population schedules were on that list. The Librarian of Congress was asked to review the list and identify anything of historical value. He identified nothing worth preserving. The list moved forward through the approval process, and on February 21, 1933, Congress authorized the destruction of the remaining 1890 census records. Within a year, the destruction was complete. A handwritten note found later in a Census Bureau file reads, "Remaining schedules destroyed by Department of Commerce in 1934," followed by a parenthetical, "not approved by the geographer." Someone inside the Bureau objected. Their objection was noted, and then the destruction happened anyway. The timing of the authorization is something that different researchers interpret differently. On February 20, 1933, one day before Congress authorized the destruction of the 1890 census, President Herbert Hoover laid the cornerstone of the National Archives building. The institution specifically designed to preserve American historical records was formally inaugurated the day before the government authorized the destruction of one of the most significant historical records in American history. Some researchers find this coincidence unremarkable, two separate government processes moving forward on adjacent days without connection. Others find it difficult to set aside. The question of whether that timing was coincidental or reflected something else about how these decisions were being made is one that the available record does not clearly resolve. What the record does make clear is this: there was a 20-year gap created in the American genealogical record at a specific and significant moment in history. Between 1880 and 1900, the federal documentation of individual American identities, names, family structures, immigration status, naturalization timelines, origins, does not exist in any comprehensive form. For millions of families, this gap cannot be filled from any other source. State records and church documents exist in some cases, but they are inconsistent and incomplete. The 1890 census was the one document that covered the entire country uniformly, and it is gone. Why this census was stored outside the fireproof vault that protected every other census is not clearly explained. Why 12 years of preservation requests ended in destruction rather than protection is not clearly explained. Why the records that reportedly survived the fire undamaged were ultimately destroyed rather than transcribed or preserved is not clearly explained. These are not small questions. They concern the disappearance of documentation for nearly 63 million people at one of the most consequential moments in American demographic history. The answers, if they exist somewhere in official records or archive correspondence, have not been made publicly clear, and the gap itself remains a hard wall in the American genealogical record, shaped exactly like the years when everything was changing and someone, or something, decided the most detailed record of who was present would not survive. Every historical mystery has an official version, a version that exists in government documents, formal reports, and institutional records, a version that has been repeated often enough that it becomes the default explanation, the one most people encounter first and accept without looking further. The story of the 1890 census has an official version too, and it begins, like many government records do, with a specific date, a specific location, and a specific sequence of events that appears, on the surface, to explain everything. The question is not whether this version exists. It clearly does. The question is whether it fully accounts for what actually happened. The official story begins on January 10, 1921. It was a Tuesday afternoon in Washington, D.C. The workday was winding down. Government employees in the Commerce building were finishing their tasks and preparing to leave for the evening. The building itself was a large federal structure, the kind that housed multiple bureaus and departments, the kind where dozens of administrative functions happened simultaneously, without most people being aware of what was stored in the floors and rooms around them. In the basement of this building, among other materials, were the population schedules from the 1890 census. Millions of individual records stored on shelving in a file room in the lower level of the building. Around 5 in the afternoon, a building fireman named James Foster was performing his routine duties when he noticed something. Smoke, not flames, not an obvious fire, but smoke, seeping through gaps and openings around pipes that ran from the boiler room into the file room nearby. This is an important detail in the official account. What Foster observed first was not a visible blaze. It was smoke coming through indirect pathways, suggesting that something was burning in a space he could not directly see. He reported what he observed to the watchman's desk. The response was prompt. The alarm was raised and fire departments were called. Multiple fire companies arrived at the Commerce Building. The response, according to the official record, was organized and reasonably fast. Firefighters assessed the situation and determined that the fire was located in the basement. To reach it and suppress it, they cut more than a dozen holes through the first floor of the building. The floor was constructed with a wooden surface sitting over approximately 6 inches of concrete beneath it. Cutting through it was the practical approach to accessing the basement from above. Once access was established, 20 separate streams of water were directed into the basement to suppress the fire. The operation continued through the evening. By 9:45 that night, the fire was officially declared under control. Firefighters remained on site for some time afterward, continuing to direct water into areas where heat remained to prevent any reignition. The building's chief clerk, once the immediate crisis had passed, opened windows to allow smoke to clear from the lower levels. And then, with the fire extinguished and the smoke beginning to clear, the building was left in the care of watchmen on overnight patrol. Most personnel went home. The immediate emergency was considered resolved. The official damage assessment that followed described the impact on the 1890 census records in specific terms. Approximately 25% of the records, according to this assessment, were destroyed directly by the fire. The flames had moved through a portion of the file room and consumed that fraction of the stored documents. The remaining records were described as having suffered water and smoke damage to varying degrees. The 20 streams of water that had been necessary to suppress the fire had soaked through the basement, covering records in standing water. Smoke had permeated through the storage areas. The combination of fire, water, and smoke had affected the condition of documents across the entire storage space. This is where the official account transitions from the immediate event to the longer aftermath. The surviving records, those not directly destroyed by flames, were described as damaged but physically present. Over the following months and years, efforts were made to assess and manage what remained. The records were moved at various points, examined by personnel, and evaluated for their condition. The official account acknowledges that the condition of the surviving materials continued to decline during this period. Paper records that have been soaked and then dried without proper archival treatment deteriorate over time. Mold develops. Pages fuse together. Ink fades or runs. The documents become progressively harder to read and eventually unusable. At first, it seems normal that preservation in this era would be difficult. In 1921, the science of archival conservation was far less developed than it is today. Techniques for stabilizing water-damaged documents, for freeze-drying paper to halt further deterioration, for carefully separating fused pages. These methods either did not exist or were not widely practiced in government storage facilities. The official account uses this context to explain why the surviving records could not be effectively saved. The technology available at the time was simply not adequate for the scale of the problem. That explanation has a certain logic to it, but it doesn't fully make sense when examined against what actually happened in the hours and days immediately following the fire. The official account continues forward through the following decade. Preservation efforts, it states, were attempted but proved difficult. Resources were limited. The National Archives infrastructure that exists today did not exist then. There was no dedicated institution specifically designed to protect federal historical records. The Census Bureau, which held the 1890 materials, was an administrative agency focused on current population work, not historical preservation. Managing deteriorating records from 30 years earlier was not a core function, and the resources allocated to it reflected that. This is the institutional context the official version offers for why the gradual decline of the surviving records was not reversed. Then, in 1932, the Census Bureau undertook a review of its holdings. This was a routine administrative process, the kind of records management exercise that government agencies conduct periodically to assess what they hold and what purpose it still serves. Materials that were no longer necessary for current business operations were identified for potential disposal. The review produced a list, And item 22 on that list was the 1890 population schedules, the original records. The Librarian of Congress was given the opportunity to review the list and identify any materials of historical interest that should be retained rather than destroyed. He reviewed the list. He identified nothing on it as worth preserving. The process moved forward. In February 1933, Congress authorized the destruction of the 1890 census records. The authorization came through the standard legislative process, documented in the official record. By 1934, the destruction had been carried out. The remaining schedules, whatever had survived the fire, the water, the smoke, and more than a decade of storage, were eliminated. The official account describes this as the end of an unfortunate process that began with an accidental fire and concluded with the destruction of what could not be salvaged. According to this version, no single decision was responsible. No single institution failed catastrophically. The loss was the result of accumulated circumstances, accident, inadequate infrastructure, and the practical limitations of the time. And this is where the explanation becomes difficult, because the official account, taken as a whole, presents a series of individually plausible events that together produce an outcome of significant historical consequence. Each step in the sequence has a reasonable explanation attached to it. The fire was accidental. The water damage was unavoidable given the methods used to fight the fire. The deterioration was the result of limited preservation technology. The destruction was a routine administrative decision. None of these individual explanations is obviously false, but the question of whether they fully account for the loss of documentation for 63 million people is something that different researchers answer differently. Some accept the official version without reservation. Government records are lost through exactly this kind of process. Accident followed by neglect followed by administrative disposal. It happens with many categories of historical documents. The 1890 census was not unique in being lost. What made it significant was the scale of the loss and the period it covered. But significance, under this view, does not imply anything beyond bad institutional management at a time when archival preservation was not a government priority. The loss was real and regrettable. It was also, according to this interpretation, straightforwardly explainable. Others find the official account less satisfying. They point to specific details that the account does not clearly resolve. Why the 1890 census was stored in a different location from every other census year in the same building, outside the fireproof vault rather than inside it, is not explained by the official record. Why no immediate salvage effort was launched on the night of the fire, when a portion of the records was reportedly undamaged, is not clearly addressed. Why 12 years of formal requests from preservation organizations were answered with assurances rather than action is noted in the historical record, but not fully explained. These are not invented questions. They come directly from examining the official account carefully. However, the timeline does not fully match the simple narrative of inevitable loss. If the records were genuinely considered unimportant and unrecoverable, it raises a question about why so many organizations spent so many years writing formal petitions asking for their preservation. The National Genealogical Society, the Daughters of the American Revolution, historians and researchers who understood what the records contained. These were not small or marginal voices. They were organized, credible institutions making formal requests through official channels. They clearly believed the records had value, and their belief was not unreasonable. At least a portion of the records was reportedly still intact years after the fire. That detail sounds minor at first, until it is examined more closely. The official account acknowledges that not everything was destroyed by the fire. Some percentage of the records survived the January 1921 event in relatively intact condition. What happened to those specific records, the ones that were neither burned nor severely water damaged, is a question the official account does not answer with clarity. They were moved. They continued to deteriorate, and eventually, along with everything else, they were authorized for destruction. Whether they could have been preserved, transcribed, or at minimum photographed before destruction is something the official record leaves unresolved. And that gap in the explanation, small as it might seem, is where the questions begin to accumulate. When an official explanation is offered for a historical loss, the first instinct is usually to accept it. Fires happen. Records are damaged. Institutions make poor decisions under pressure. These are common enough occurrences that they rarely require deeper examination. But there are moments when a specific detail inside the official account draws attention, not because it proves something, but because it doesn't align with the rest of the explanation in a way that can be easily set aside. The storage arrangement of the 1890 census is one of those details. It is not a matter of interpretation. It is a documented fact, and when examined carefully, it raises a question that the official account has never fully answered. The Commerce Building basement, where the 1890 census records were stored, contained a fireproof vault. This is not a disputed point. The vault existed, it was functional, and it was being used for exactly the purpose a fireproof vault is designed for, protecting important documents from fire damage. Government record storage in that era was not a sophisticated science, but the basic principle was understood. If documents were valuable and needed to survive a fire, you stored them in a fireproof space. The Commerce Building had that space. It was present and available, and it was being used. The 1880 census was stored inside the vault. The records from that decade, covering a population count taken 10 years before the 1890 survey, were considered worth protecting. They were placed inside the fireproof structure and kept there. The 1900 census was also stored inside the vault. The records from 10 years after 1890, documenting the American population at the turn of the century, received the same protection. The 1910 census was inside the vault as well. 3 separate decades of American census records, stored in the same building, all given the protection of the fireproof vault. All of them survived the January 1921 fire without significant damage. The 1890 census was not inside the vault. It was stored outside it, on open pine shelving in an unlocked file room in the basement. And this is where the first real problem with the official explanation appears. Because the arrangement was not a matter of space constraints that forced administrators to make difficult choices. The vault held multiple census years simultaneously. The infrastructure for protected storage was present and operational. The decision to store 1890 differently from the censuses immediately before and after it was a specific decision, or at minimum, a specific failure to act, that resulted in that year's records being placed in the most exposed position in the building. The location matters beyond just being outside the vault. The unlocked file room, where the 1890 records were stored, was positioned directly next to the boiler room. A boiler room is, by its nature, a space that generates heat, houses combustible fuel systems, and presents a persistent fire risk in any building where it operates. Placing paper records, millions of individual paper documents, in an unlocked room, sharing a wall with a boiler room is not standard practice for protecting materials of any significance. And adjacent to the file room on the other side was a carpenter's workshop. Carpentry work produces sawdust. It produces wood shavings. Both are among the most readily combustible materials that can exist in a building environment. Dry wood particulate ignites quickly and can spread fire rapidly. That detail sounds minor at first, until it is examined more closely. The 1890 census records were stored between a heat-generating combustion system and a workshop full of flammable material, and they were stored on open pine shelving, not in sealed containers, not in metal cabinets, not in any structure that would provide even minimal protection from a fire originating in either adjacent space. The National Archives, in its own documentation of the 1921 fire, describes the 1890 census as being, in its exact language, first in the path of the fireman. That phrase is significant. It does not describe the records as being in a difficult location or an imperfect storage arrangement. It places them at the front of the fire's path, the most exposed position possible given where the fire originated. At first, it seems normal to look for an administrative explanation. Government storage decisions in the early 20th century were not always made with careful historical consideration. Records managers were primarily concerned with current operational needs, not long-term preservation. Documents from 30 years earlier might reasonably have been considered lower priority than more recent materials. Under this interpretation, the 1890 census was stored poorly because no one thought carefully enough about what it contained or what its loss would mean. The decision, or the failure to make any deliberate decision, was a product of bureaucratic indifference rather than anything more deliberate. But this is where it becomes unclear, because the same institution that stored the 1890 census on open pine shelving next to a boiler room simultaneously stored the 1880 and 1900 censuses inside a fireproof vault in the same building. The argument that administrators did not understand the importance of protecting census records does not hold when the evidence shows they were actively protecting census records from other years. The behavior was not uniform. The protection was selective. The 1880 census got the vault. The 1900 census got the vault. The 1910 census got the vault. The 1890 census got the open shelving next to the fire risk. This raises a straightforward question that the official account does not answer. What was different about 1890? Why did that specific year receive different treatment from every census immediately surrounding it? The official record does not contain a clear explanation for this discrepancy. No documented administrative decision survives explaining why the 1890 records were placed outside the vault. No correspondence has been identified that discusses the storage arrangement and the reasoning behind it. The decision, if it was made deliberately, left no clear paper trail. And if it was simply an oversight, something no one noticed or corrected before the fire, then it represents an oversight that somehow applied only to one specific census year, while every other year received proper treatment. Some researchers accept the oversight explanation. They note that government record management in this period was often inconsistent, and that it would not be unusual for a significant error to go unnoticed for years. Under this view, the selective storage arrangement reflects nothing more than the kind of institutional disorganization that has always characterized large bureaucracies. Someone made a poor decision or failed to make a proper one. The records ended up in the wrong place. The fire arrived before anyone corrected the arrangement. The loss was the result of accumulated carelessness, not deliberate action. Others disagree. They point out that accepting the oversight explanation requires believing that the same institution, which correctly protected 3 other census years, somehow failed to apply the same standard to just one, and that the one it failed to protect happened to be the most detailed population census in American history up to that point. The probability of this specific failure applying to this specific year, rather than to one of the others, is something these researchers find difficult to explain through simple carelessness alone. It doesn't fully make sense that the outlier in the storage arrangement was also the outlier in terms of historical significance. And this is where the explanation starts to weaken further. The 1890 census was not simply another population count. It was the first to use mechanical tabulation technology. It was the first to ask detailed questions about immigration status and naturalization timelines. It documented Civil War veterans, family structures, origins, literacy, home ownership, and disability status in ways no previous census had attempted. It captured America at the exact moment the frontier was declared closed, and before mass immigration through official processing centers began. Of all the census years stored in that building, 1890 was arguably the most historically significant for understanding American identity during a period of major transition, and it was the only one stored outside the fireproof vault. However, the timeline does not fully match the idea that this was simply bad luck applied randomly. If the storage arrangement had been applied uniformly, if all census years had been stored on open shelving outside the vault, then the fire's destruction would be easier to understand as an indiscriminate accident. But the arrangement was not uniform. It was specific. One year was treated differently from all the others, and that year was 1890. The distinction is documented. It is present in the official record. It is not invented or exaggerated. It simply has not been explained. There is an additional layer to this that deserves attention. The file room where the 1890 records were stored was unlocked. This is mentioned in historical accounts of the fire and its aftermath, but it rarely receives sustained attention. The fireproof vault, by definition, could be secured. Records stored inside it were protected not only from fire, but from unauthorized access. Records stored in an unlocked file room in the basement of a large federal building were accessible to anyone who could enter the basement. Whether this matters to the broader question of what happened to the records is genuinely unclear, but it is a detail that sits alongside the storage discrepancy without a satisfying explanation attached to it. The phrase used by the National Archives, "first in the path of the fireman," carries more weight when considered against the full storage arrangement. The records were positioned as close to the fire's point of origin as possible given the building's layout. They were stored in the most combustible environment available. They were on open shelving rather than in any protective container. And they were outside the one structure in the basement specifically designed to prevent exactly the kind of damage that occurred. Whether each of these individual factors was the result of oversight, indifference, or something else remains an open question. But together, they describe a storage arrangement that seems almost designed to ensure maximum vulnerability for the one census year that documented America most comprehensively. That observation does not resolve anything. It does not confirm a deliberate act. It does not prove that the storage arrangement was intentional rather than negligent. What it does is identify a pattern, a consistent set of decisions or failures that all pointed in the same direction, toward greater exposure for the 1890 record specifically. And when a pattern of that kind exists in the historical record, without a clear explanation attached to it, the questions it raises tend to persist. Why was 1890 different? Why was it stored where it was? Why did the institution that clearly knew how to protect census records choose not to protect this one? The official account acknowledges the storage arrangement. It does not explain it. And that gap, small as it might seem in the full context of the story, is where the first serious doubt about the official explanation takes hold. Before examining what was lost, it helps to understand what was actually there. Because the 1890 census is often described in general terms, a population record, a government document, a historical artifact, in ways that do not fully convey what it contained or why its absence creates such a specific and significant problem. When researchers and genealogists describe hitting a wall at 1890, they are not describing a minor inconvenience. They are describing the disappearance of a document that was fundamentally different from every census that came before it. Understanding that difference is important, because the significance of what was lost is directly connected to how unusual it was in the first place. Most people have a general sense of what a census is. Enumerators go door to door. They count the people living in each household. They record names and ages. The information is compiled into population totals that governments use for administrative purposes. That description fits many census years reasonably well. It does not fit 1890. The 1890 census was designed with a level of ambition that separated it clearly from its predecessors. The people who planned it understood that America was changing in ways that previous censuses had not fully captured, and they built an instrument specifically designed to document those changes in detail. The first significant departure from previous practice was technological. For the first time in American census history, the 1890 count used a mechanical tabulation system developed by Herman Hollerith. Hollerith had designed a punch card system, individual cards with holes punched in specific positions to represent different data points that could be read by electrical tabulating machines. This allowed census data to be processed far more quickly and with greater accuracy than the manual counting methods used in previous decades. The technology worked. The 1890 census was tabulated faster and more completely than any previous count, and the system Hollerith developed went on to become the foundation of what would eventually become IBM. The 1890 census was, in a very direct sense, the moment when modern data processing began in America. That detail sounds minor at first, until it is examined more closely. The records from this specific census represented the first large-scale application of a technology that would reshape how information was organized and stored for the next century. But the technological innovation, significant as it was, is not what makes the content of the 1890 census most notable. What makes it notable is the range and depth of the questions it asked. Previous censuses had recorded names, ages, and basic occupational information. The 1890 census went considerably further. It asked residents directly about their immigration status, not just where they were born, but how long they had been in the United States, whether they had filed their first papers for citizenship, whether they had completed the naturalization process or were still classified as aliens, what language they spoke at home if it was not English. These questions had not been asked with this level of specificity before. For a country in the middle of a massive demographic transformation driven by immigration, they represented a detailed accounting of who had arrived, when, and what their legal relationship to the country was. The documentation of Civil War service added another layer of historical significance. By 1890, the Civil War had ended 25 years earlier. Veterans were aging. Many were in their 50s, 60s, or older. The census asked directly whether each individual had served in the Union or Confederate forces. It recorded this information at the household level, alongside names and family relationships. This created a documented baseline of who the living veterans were, where they were living, and who they were living with. For families trying to establish service records decades later, for purposes of pensions, benefits, or simply historical knowledge, this information was irreplaceable, and it is largely gone. For women, the census included questions that no previous count had asked. Specifically, it recorded how many children each woman had given birth to and how many of those children were still living at the time of the count. This information, gathered across millions of households, created a picture of childhood mortality rates and family composition that researchers have never been able to fully reconstruct from other sources. The gap is not just in names and addresses. It is in data about the lived experience of American families during a period of significant social and economic change. How many children survived in 1890? How many did not? That information does not exist in any comprehensive federal form. The racial categories used in the 1890 census were more detailed than those in any previous count. Earlier censuses had used broad categories. The 1890 census introduced finer distinctions, classifications that attempted to document mixed heritage and specific origin with greater precision than before. Whether those categories were scientifically valid or reflect the social assumptions of that era is a separate discussion. What matters for the question of what was lost is that they represented a more granular attempt to document racial and ethnic composition than had been attempted before, and that level of detail, applied across nearly 63 million people, created a baseline that researchers in later decades found impossible to reconstruct from other sources. The structure of the records themselves was also different. Previous census counts had often been recorded as simple lists, rows of names with corresponding data fields. The 1890 census created individual family schedules. Each household received its own document. The relationships between household members were specified. Who was the head of the household? Who was a spouse? Who were children? Who were boarders or servants or relatives? The origins of each individual were recorded alongside their legal status as citizens or non-citizens. These were not population lists. They were household portraits, detailed, relationship map documents that showed not just who was alive in 1890, but how people were connected to one another and what their legal standing in the country was. This is where the timing becomes particularly significant. The 1890 census was not taken during an ordinary period in American history. It was taken at a moment of transition that many historians consider one of the most consequential in the country's development. The census itself formally documented the closing of the American frontier. The superintendent of the census issued a statement that year noting that the continuous line of unsettled land that had defined the western edge of American expansion could no longer be identified on a map. The frontier was gone. Frederick Jackson Turner, one of the most influential American historians of the era, built his entire framework for understanding American identity on this single census finding. The frontier, in his argument, had shaped the American character. Its closing marked the end of a formative chapter, and the 1890 census was the document that defined that ending. But this is where it becomes unclear. The closing of the frontier was not simply a geographic observation. It marked the moment when the direction of American growth shifted. The open land that had absorbed immigrants and offered economic opportunity through settlement was no longer available in the same way. The people who arrived after 1890 entered a different America, one where cities were growing, industry was expanding, and the pathways to economic participation were changing. The 1890 census captured the last moment before that shift fully took hold. It documented who was already present, how long they had been there, what they owned, where they lived, and what their relationship to the country was. It was a baseline for everything that followed. And then, 18 months after the 1890 census was taken, Ellis Island opened. The processing center that would become the primary entry point for millions of immigrants arriving in America began operations in January 1892. From that point forward, the federal government had a systematic mechanism for documenting new arrivals, recording names, origins, health status, and destinations as people entered the country through official channels. Ellis Island records are detailed, well-preserved, and extensively researched. They document the great wave of immigration that transformed American demographics in the decades around the turn of the century. But they document arrivals after 1892. They do not document who was already here before the processing center opened. The 1890 census was the only comprehensive federal record that documented the population that existed before the Ellis Island era began. It captured the people who had arrived through earlier, less systematically documented pathways. It recorded the immigrants who had been in the country for years or decades before official processing centers existed. It documented their naturalization status, whether they had formalized their relationship to the country through legal channels or were still living as resident aliens. This information, the baseline of who was already present in America before the great documented wave of immigration arrived, exists nowhere else in federal records with the same level of comprehensiveness. At first, it seems normal to treat this as a coincidence of timing. The census was taken. Ellis Island opened shortly after. The records were later destroyed by fire and policy. These events happened in sequence, but sequence is not necessarily connection. That is a reasonable position. However, the timeline does not fully match the idea that this is simply an unremarkable sequence of administrative events, because the specific combination, the most detailed pre-Ellis Island population survey ever conducted, destroyed before systematic archival preservation existed, leaving an unverifiable gap at exactly the moment American demographics began their most significant modern transformation, is a combination that does not have an obvious parallel in American record-keeping history. What researchers are left with, in the absence of the 1890 records, is a population that existed and was documented and then became undocumentable. The 9.2 million foreign-born Americans recorded in the 1890 census cannot have their immigration timelines verified through federal sources. The naturalization records embedded in those schedules, showing who had filed for citizenship and who had completed the process, are gone. The family structures showing who lived with whom, who was connected to whom across households, who had arrived together and who had come separately, all of it absent. The level of detail that made the 1890 census historically significant is precisely what makes its loss so difficult to work around. There is no equivalent source. There is no comparable record from the same period that covers the same population with the same specificity. And this raises a question that sits at the center of why the 1890 census matters beyond genealogy or historical research. If you wanted to understand who was already in America before the documented era of mass immigration began, before Ellis Island, before systematic arrival records, before the transformation of the late 19th and early 20th centuries reshaped American demographics, the 1890 census was the document that could tell you. It documented the starting point, the baseline, the population as it existed at the last moment before everything changed. That document is gone, and the questions about what it contained, who it accounted for, and what its loss means for our ability to understand that specific period of American history remain, for the most part, unanswered. Before examining what was lost in the aftermath of the 1921 fire, it is worth slowing down and looking carefully at what happened in the hours immediately following it, because those first hours are not well understood, and the decisions made or not made during that window are among the most difficult aspects of this entire story to explain in straightforward terms. The fire broke out in the Commerce Building in Washington, D.C., where the 1890 census records were stored. By the time it was extinguished, the damage was visible and significant. But fires in large storage facilities do not always destroy everything at once. Water from firefighting efforts floods lower levels. Smoke penetrates areas the flames never reached. The surviving material, whatever the fire left behind, was still present, still potentially recoverable, still sitting in the building when the last of the smoke began to clear. And this is where the first inconsistency appears. because what happened next was not what most people would expect. When the flames were brought under control that evening, the chief clerk on duty opened windows to allow the smoke to clear from the building. That was a reasonable response to immediate conditions. But then, almost everyone went home. There were no emergency salvage teams called in. No archivists were contacted. No conservators were brought to the site. No systematic effort was made that night to assess what had survived or to begin the process of protecting it from further damage. The people responsible for those records left the building, and the records that had survived the fire were left to sit in whatever condition they were in, waterlogged, smoke-damaged, exposed through the night. The following morning, workers who returned to the building found ankle-deep water covering records in many of the lower storage areas. That water had been sitting there since the fire was extinguished. It had soaked into shelves, into stacked documents, into the materials holding those documents together. Hours of exposure had done damage that the fire itself had not. And this raises a question that does not have a fully satisfying answer. If the records were considered important enough to have been retained and stored in a federal building, why was no immediate action taken to protect whatever had survived the fire? The question is not rhetorical. It is a genuine gap in the explanation of what happened, and it sits at the center of why this chapter of the story is difficult to accept on straightforward terms. Part of the difficulty is that the damage assessments from this period do not agree with one another. Different reports, produced at different times and by different parties, describe the extent of the destruction in notably different ways. Some assessments stated that approximately 25% of the records had been destroyed by the fire itself. Others described an additional 50% as having been rendered unusable by water and smoke damage. Materials that had technically survived the flames, but were too deteriorated to be read or processed. These numbers, taken together, suggest a significant but not total loss. They suggest that a portion of the records remained in some form after the fire. But a third assessment complicates this picture considerably. At least one documented evaluation from the period found that approximately 38% of the census records were undamaged, not partially damaged, not recoverable with effort, undamaged. That figure, applied to the total number of individual records that made up the 1890 census count, represents close to 24 million names, 24 million individual household entries, with the questions about immigration status, Civil War service, family composition, and naturalization that made the 1890 census historically unique, potentially intact and available after the fire. That is not a small fragment. That is a substantial portion of one of the most significant population surveys ever conducted in the United States. And what happened to those records is where the explanation becomes considerably harder to follow. They sat, for months, the records that had survived the fire, including those assessed as undamaged, remained in storage at the Commerce Building. They were not transcribed. They were not photographed. No microfilming effort was organized, even though photographic reproduction of documents was a known and available technique by this period. No team of workers was assembled to work through the undamaged portions and create copies that could be preserved independently of the originals. The record simply remained in place, in a building that had recently experienced a significant fire, in conditions that were no longer controlled or suitable for long-term preservation. This is where it becomes unclear why the standard response to a damaged archive was not applied. There is a version of this story in which the 1890 census records were treated the way important damaged archives typically are, with urgency, with professional assessment, with systematic efforts to preserve whatever remained. That version does not match the documented record of what actually occurred. The version that does match the documented record is one in which records assessed as undamaged were allowed to remain in deteriorating conditions for an extended period, with no meaningful preservation effort undertaken during that time. The distinction matters, because the question is not only what the fire destroyed. The question is what happened to the portion the fire did not destroy. After remaining in the Commerce Building for months following the fire, the surviving records were eventually moved. But the move did not bring them into conditions more suitable for preservation. They were relocated to storage that, by subsequent accounts, was not significantly better than where they had been. And then they were moved again. The records changed locations more than once in the years following the fire, and each move appears to have introduced additional deterioration rather than halting it. Physical transfer is itself damaging to wet or smoke-affected documents. Paper that has been waterlogged and then dried improperly becomes brittle. Ink that was exposed to moisture may have already begun to fade or bleed. Moving such materials without careful handling accelerates the damage rather than preventing it. By the time any serious attention was turned back to the surviving records, more than a decade had passed since the fire. The window during which professional intervention could have recovered meaningful content from the undamaged and partially damaged portions had narrowed considerably. The materials that had been assessed as undamaged in the immediate aftermath of the fire had been sitting in substandard conditions, moved multiple times, and left without conservation treatment for years. Whatever was recoverable in 1921 was less recoverable by the time anyone looked at it carefully. And this pattern, the delay, the repeated relocations, the absence of urgency, is not easily explained by administrative oversight alone. This is where the question of intent becomes relevant, even if it cannot be answered directly. Administrative failures happen. Resources are limited. Priorities shift. Bureaucracies do not always respond effectively to emergencies, especially when the emergency involves materials whose value is not immediately obvious to the people in charge of responding. These are real factors, and they account for many genuine cases of archival neglect throughout history. The question is whether they account for this specific case, with this specific combination of circumstances. A census that was uniquely detailed, a fire that left a documented percentage of the records intact, a response that did not include any meaningful recovery effort, a decade of further deterioration, and at the end of that decade, records that had once been assessed as undamaged were in conditions that made comprehensive recovery impossible. Some researchers who have examined this period closely have noted that the timeline is difficult to reconcile with standard explanations of administrative negligence. Negligence typically looks like inattention. Things fall through the cracks because nobody is paying close enough attention. What the record of the 1890 census aftermath describes looks more like consistent inattention applied specifically to one set of records over an extended period. The absence of a transcription effort, the absence of photographic reproduction, the absence of systematic assessment even after the fire's immediate chaos had passed. Each of these absences is individually explainable. Together, over a period of more than a decade, they form a pattern that some find difficult to attribute entirely to coincidence or bureaucratic failure. Others disagree with that interpretation. They point to the broader context of federal record-keeping in the early 20th century, which was inconsistent and often inadequate by later standards. They argue that the 1890 census records were not uniquely neglected, that many federal archives from this period were handled poorly, and that applying later standards of archival preservation to decisions made a century ago distorts the historical picture. This is also a reasonable position. The infrastructure for systematic document preservation that exists today did not exist in the same form in the 1920s and 1930s. Expectations were different. Resources were different. The professional field of archival science was still developing. But even within that context, the specific circumstances of the 1890 census records stand out, because the people involved were not unaware of the record's value. The 1890 census had been processed using the most advanced technology available at the time. Its results had been published and discussed. The decision to conduct such a detailed count had been deliberate and informed by a specific understanding of what the country needed to know about itself. The value of the underlying records, the household schedules, the individual entries, the raw data behind the published totals, was not a secret, and yet the response to the fire, and the decade that followed it, does not reflect an awareness of that value in any concrete or documented way. What remains at the end of this examination is not a clear answer, but a clearer picture of the question. The fire destroyed a portion of the 1890 census records. That is documented and not disputed. But the fire was not the only factor in the loss. A documented assessment found roughly 38% of the records undamaged in the immediate aftermath. Those records were not recovered. They were not transcribed, photographed, or systematically preserved. They deteriorated over years of inadequate storage and repeated relocation. By the time the surviving materials were formally addressed, the window for meaningful recovery had largely closed. The explanation for why that window was allowed to close, why no urgency was applied, why no professional effort was organized, why records documented as intact were permitted to decay, is not fully available in the historical record, and that absence of explanation is, in its own way, part of the story. To understand what happened in December 1932, it is necessary to go back 12 years earlier, to the period immediately following the fire, because the fire itself, as damaging as it was, did not end the story of the 1890 census records. It began a different chapter, one that lasted over a decade and involved not silence or indifference, but active communication. Letters were written, petitions were filed, formal protests were submitted through official channels, and for 12 years, those efforts received responses. That is the part of this story that is often overlooked. The people who cared about these records were not ignored immediately. They were told, repeatedly and over an extended period, that the records were being handled appropriately. Historians were among the first to raise concerns after the fire. They understood, perhaps more clearly than the administrative officials managing the physical records, what the 1890 census represented. They knew that it was not simply a population count. It was a document that captured a specific and unrepeatable moment in American demographic history. The last comprehensive survey taken before Ellis Island, before the great documented wave of late 19th and early 20th century immigration, fully transformed the country's population. Losing it was not a minor inconvenience for historical research. It was the removal of a baseline that could not be reconstructed from any other existing source. These concerns were communicated formally, through letters to government offices and through published commentary. And the response, in the early years after the fire, was reassurance. Genealogists were also deeply affected. The work of tracing family histories through the census record depends on the ability to move backward through each decade, from 1930 to 1920 to 1910, and further. Each census year provides a window into where a family was, who was in the household, and what their circumstances were at that specific moment. The 1890 census was supposed to provide that window for families trying to document the lives of relatives who had been alive in that decade. With the records gone or deteriorating, a gap appeared in the census chain that could not be filled by any equivalent federal source. Organizations representing genealogical researchers began to formalize their concerns. The absence of the 1890 records was not an abstract historical problem. It was a practical obstacle for thousands of people trying to document the lives of their own families. The National Genealogical Society took this concern to the highest available level. They did not simply write letters to the Census Bureau. They petitioned Congress directly. This is a formal step, one that requires organization, documentation, and a belief that the issue is serious enough to warrant legislative attention. Their petition communicated what was at stake. It described the record's historical and genealogical value. It asked Congress to take action to ensure that whatever remained of the 1890 census was preserved and, where possible, recovered. This was not an informal complaint. It was an organized effort by a professional organization to bring a specific problem to the attention of the country's legislative body. And it raises a question that deserves to be considered carefully. What response did that petition receive? The Daughters of the American Revolution also entered the record during this period. They filed a formal protest regarding the handling of the 1890 census materials. The DAR, as an organization, has a specific and practical interest in historical records. Their membership requirements are based on documented lineage, and census records are among the primary tools for establishing that documentation. Their protest was not based on abstract concern. It was based on direct experience with the gap that the 1890 record's absence created for their members and for anyone attempting to establish documented connections to that period of American history. Their formal protest added institutional weight to the concerns that historians and genealogists had already raised. And the response to all of these efforts, the letters, the petitions, the formal protests, was consistent. Over 12 years, the assurances given to these organizations did not change significantly. The records would be protected. No destruction was planned. Efforts were ongoing. These were not vague dismissals. They were specific assurances, communicated formally, over an extended period. And this is where it becomes unclear, because if those assurances were genuine, they should have produced some visible result. A transcription project, a photographic survey of undamaged materials, a formal assessment of what remained and what could still be recovered, some documented effort that corresponded to the assurances being given. The record of that period does not show those results. What the record does show is that the assurances continued without significant action behind them for over a decade. Organizations that had filed formal petitions and protests received written responses that acknowledged their concerns and provided reassurance. But the physical condition of the surviving records during this period was not improving. The materials that had been assessed as undamaged or only partially damaged in 1921 were deteriorating in substandard storage conditions. Each year that passed without intervention narrowed the window for meaningful recovery. The gap between what was being communicated to these organizations and what was actually happening to the physical records is a detail that does not resolve cleanly. It remains in the story as an unaddressed inconsistency. Then, in December 1932, something changed. The chief clerk of the Census Bureau submitted a list of records that the Bureau had determined were no longer necessary for current business purposes. The framing is important. The question being asked was not whether the records had historical value. It was whether they were still needed for the active work of the Census Bureau. And on that basis, operational utility rather than historical significance, the list moved forward. Item 22 on that list read simply, Population 1890, Original. Those 4 words represented the surviving physical remains of the most detailed population survey conducted in 19th century America. They appeared on an administrative list alongside other materials deemed no longer useful for day-to-day government operations. The list was sent to the Librarian of Congress for review. This was the step in the process specifically designed to catch records of historical value before they were authorized for destruction. The Librarian of Congress, whose institutional purpose is the preservation of materials significant to American history and culture, was given the opportunity to identify any items on the list that should be retained rather than destroyed. The 1890 census records, including whatever remained of the undamaged portion assessed in 1921, were on that list. The Librarian of Congress reviewed it and identified nothing worth preserving. That finding is part of the official record. It is documented, and it is, when examined against the background of 12 years of formal petitions and protests from historians, genealogists, and preservation organizations, one of the more difficult details in this entire story to accept at face value. With the Librarian of Congress having raised no objection, the list moved to the next stage of the authorization process. And this is where the timeline introduces a detail that many researchers have noted, and that does not have a straightforward explanation. On February 20th, 1933, President Herbert Hoover laid the cornerstone of the National Archives building in Washington, D.C. This was a significant moment in the history of American record-keeping. The National Archives had been established specifically to address the problem that had allowed records like the 1890 census to deteriorate: the absence of a centralized, professionally managed institution for preserving federal historical materials. The cornerstone ceremony marked the beginning of the physical construction of a building that would house and protect American historical records for future generations. One day later, on February 21st, 1933, Congress authorized the destruction of the 1890 census records. The institution created to preserve American history was inaugurated on February 20th. The authorization to destroy one of the most significant American historical records of the 19th century was issued on February 21st. The gap between those two events is 24 hours. That detail sounds minor at first, until it is examined more closely, because the timing does not fit the pattern of administrative decisions happening independently of one another. The National Archives cornerstone and the census destruction authorization did not occur weeks or months apart. They occurred on consecutive days. Some historians who have examined this sequence describe it as coincidence. Administrative processes move on their own timelines. The destruction authorization had been working its way through the bureaucratic process since December 1932. The National Archives cornerstone had been scheduled independently. The fact that they fell on consecutive days reflects the pace of government procedure, not deliberate coordination. That explanation is possible. It accounts for the timing without requiring any additional interpretation, but it does not fully address why those two specific events, the founding of a preservation institution and the destruction of a specific historical record, happen to align so precisely, or why no one in the authorization process appears to have noted the irony of the timing. Others find the sequence more difficult to accept as simple coincidence. They point to the 12 years of formal petitions and assurances that preceded it. They point to the Librarian of Congress finding nothing worth preserving on a list that included the 1890 census records, despite years of documented concern from professional organizations. They point to the fact that the destruction authorization came through the exact moment that a new institution was being created to prevent such losses. And they note that the combination of these details, not any single one of them, but all of them together, forms a pattern that resists simple explanation. Whether that pattern reflects deliberate decision-making or an extraordinary series of administrative failures is a question that the available record does not resolve. What is documentable is the result. The 1890 census records, including whatever remained of the portion that had been assessed as undamaged or recoverable after the 1921 fire, were authorized for destruction in February 1933. The destruction followed. The records that had survived the fire, that had sat for over a decade in deteriorating conditions without systematic preservation efforts, were formally eliminated. The assurances given to historians, genealogists, and preservation organizations over 12 years did not produce the outcome those organizations had been told to expect, and the records that those assurances were meant to protect are now gone. The question that remains, and it is a question, not a conclusion, is what those 12 years of assurances represented. If the intent had always been to preserve the records, the outcome should have been different. If the intent had never been to preserve them, the assurances were something other than what they appeared to be. And if the decision to authorize destruction on February 21, 1933, was genuinely unconnected to the cornerstone ceremony on February 20th, the timing remains an unexplained detail in a story that already contains more unexplained details than straightforward ones. The documents that might answer these questions, the internal correspondence, the decision-making records, the communications between the Census Bureau and the offices that reviewed the destruction list, exist in fragments. Some have been examined, others have not been fully accounted for, and the full picture of what was decided, by whom, and on what basis, remains incomplete. There is a particular way that patterns become visible in historical research. It does not usually happen all at once. It happens gradually, as individual events that initially seemed unrelated begin to appear in the same general direction. Each event, examined on its own, has an explanation: a fire, an administrative decision, a record deemed no longer necessary. These things happen in archives and government offices throughout history. They are not unusual in isolation, but when several of them occur in sequence, involving the same set of records, over the same general period, and each one moves in the same direction, toward less documentation rather than more, the individual explanations begin to feel less complete than they did before. The timeline surrounding the 1890 census does not begin with the 1921 fire. It begins earlier, in 1896, 25 years before the fire that damaged the main population schedules. A separate fire destroyed a different set of 1890 records. These were the special schedules, a category of census documentation that went beyond the standard household surveys. The special schedules covered mortality records, documenting deaths and their causes across the population. They covered crime statistics. They covered what the Census Bureau of that era called special classes, a broad category that included institutions, residents of almshouses, prisoners, and others whose circumstances placed them outside the standard household structure. These were not duplicate records. They were not secondary copies of information available elsewhere. They were a distinct and specific layer of documentation about the condition of American society in 1890. And in 1896, they burned. That fire has received considerably less attention than the 1921 fire. It is mentioned in some histories of the period and absent from others. The circumstances surrounding it are less thoroughly documented than the later event. What is known is that it destroyed records that would have contributed significantly to understanding the social and institutional landscape of America in 1890. Information about mortality rates, about incarceration, about the populations living outside mainstream household structures. This is not a minor category of loss. Mortality records from this period, if they had survived, would have filled gaps that researchers have since been unable to address through other sources. The 1896 fire removed them from the available record before most people had fully understood what they contained. Then came 1921. The fire in the Commerce Building damaged the main population schedules, the household-by-household surveys that recorded names, ages, immigration status, family composition, and Civil War service across the entire enumerated population of nearly 63 million people. As examined in an earlier part of this investigation, the fire did not destroy everything. A documented assessment found approximately 38% of the records undamaged. But the response to the fire did not include meaningful recovery efforts. The surviving materials were left, relocated, and allowed to deteriorate over the years that followed. And then, in December 1932, the chief clerk of the Census Bureau submitted the administrative list that placed what remained under formal review for destruction authorization. The authorization came in February 1933. The physical destruction followed in 1934. By the time it was completed, the sequence was clear. 1896, special schedules gone. 1921, main population schedules damaged, surviving portions left to deteriorate. 1932, surviving materials listed for destruction. 1933, destruction authorized. 1934, destruction carried out. Each step moved in one direction. At no point in this sequence did any event move in the opposite direction. No recovery effort succeeded. No preservation initiative produced lasting results. No portion of the records was salvaged and placed in conditions that would allow it to survive long-term. The movement was consistently, and without exception, toward the elimination of documentation. And this is where it becomes difficult to treat the sequence as simply a series of unrelated administrative events. A reasonable response to this observation is that the direction of the sequence reflects the nature of loss generally. Records are destroyed by fire, neglect, and administrative decision all the time. The fact that multiple such events occurred involving the same set of records does not necessarily indicate anything beyond ordinary institutional failure. Archives throughout history have been lost to combinations of exactly these factors: fire, inadequate storage, bureaucratic indifference. The 1890 census, on this reading, is a particularly significant example of a common problem, rather than evidence of something more deliberate. That interpretation is available, and it should be taken seriously, but it does not fully account for everything that follows, because the pattern that researchers have identified does not stop with the 1890 census itself. It extends outward. When the records of the 1890s and early 1900s are examined more broadly, not just the census schedules, but the wider body of documentation from this transitional period in American history, some researchers have noted a consistency that goes beyond what would be expected from ordinary archival loss. Newspaper reports of certain archaeological discoveries from this period become difficult to locate after a certain point. Reports that existed and were circulated appear to have stopped being referenced in later publications. This is not a universal observation, and it is not uniformly documented, but it has been noted by more than one researcher working independently in different areas of historical inquiry. Photographs present a similar pattern in certain subject areas. Photographs that are documented as having existed, referenced in contemporary accounts, listed in catalogs, described in correspondence, become difficult or impossible to locate in the archives, where they might reasonably be expected to be held. This does not mean they were deliberately removed. Photographs are lost, damaged, and misplaced in archives regularly. But when the photographs that become difficult to locate are concentrated in specific subject areas from a specific historical period, the distribution of that loss begins to look less random than ordinary archival attrition would suggest. Some researchers have noted this. Others have looked at the same evidence and found it insufficient to support any conclusion beyond the general fragility of photographic materials from this era. References in published texts present a third category of observation. Researchers working in several different areas have noted instances where references that appear in earlier editions of published works, encyclopedias, reference volumes, historical compilations, do not appear in later editions of the same works. The earlier edition contains a reference to a specific discovery, a specific site, a specific finding. The later edition, covering the same subject matter, omits it. This happens in publishing for many reasons. Editions are revised. Content is updated based on new information. Earlier claims that were found to be inaccurate are removed. These are normal parts of the publishing process. But this is where it becomes unclear, because the pattern that some researchers have identified is not one of corrections, of earlier errors being removed in light of better evidence. It is one of references disappearing without replacement or explanation, in subject areas that overlap with the transitional period that the 1890 census was uniquely positioned to document. Whether any of these observations are connected to one another, or to the loss of the 1890 census records, is genuinely unclear. That qualification is important and should not be treated as a polite disclaimer. It reflects a real limit in what the available evidence supports. The loss of the special schedules in 1896, the fire in 1921, the destruction authorization in 1933, and the broader pattern of disappearing documentation from this period could each have separate explanations that have nothing to do with one another. Fires happen. Administrative decisions are made on narrow operational grounds without reference to broader historical significance. Publishing decisions are made for editorial reasons that are never fully documented. Each of these statements is true. And yet, the cumulative effect of examining them together produces a question that individual explanations do not fully address. The question is about direction. In the normal course of archival history, loss and preservation exist in tension with each other. Records are lost to fire and neglect. Other records are saved through archival effort, institutional attention, and deliberate investment in preservation. The net result, over any extended period, tends to be mixed. Some things are lost, others are kept, and the overall picture of what survives reflects both failure and success. What the period surrounding the 1890 census presents, when examined across multiple categories of documentation, is a pattern that is not mixed. The losses concentrate in specific subject areas and specific time periods. The preservation efforts, where they existed, did not produce lasting results in those same areas. The direction of the overall movement is consistent in a way that mixed, ordinary archival history does not typically produce. This is what researchers who study this period mean when they say the 1890 census fits a broader pattern. They are not claiming that all of these losses were coordinated or deliberate. The claim is more specific and more careful than that. It is that when you map the losses, the census records, the special schedules, the newspaper reports, the photographs, the missing references, they cluster around a particular period and a particular set of subjects. The period is the transitional decades of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The subjects are the documentation of America's population, its archaeological record, and its historical landscape during that specific window. That clustering is what raises questions, not because clustering proves anything, but because it is the kind of pattern that, in other investigative contexts, would be considered significant enough to examine carefully. The 1890 census sits at the center of this cluster for a specific reason. It was the most comprehensive federal effort to document the American population at the precise moment this transitional period was beginning. It recorded who was present before Ellis Island opened. It captured the demographic baseline before the great wave of documented immigration transformed the country's population. It was, in the language used throughout this investigation, a starting point, a record of conditions before everything changed. And it is gone. Not partially gone. Not mostly gone. Gone through a sequence of events spanning nearly 4 decades, each of which moved in the same direction. Some people who have examined this sequence find the pattern convincing enough to support the conclusion that something more than ordinary archival failure was at work. Others find the same evidence insufficient to go beyond ordinary institutional negligence and the general fragility of 19th-century record-keeping systems. Both positions are held by people who have looked carefully at the available evidence. The disagreement between them is real, and it reflects a genuine limit in what can be established from the documents that remain. That limit is itself part of the story, because the documents that might resolve the disagreement, internal correspondence, decision-making records, the full accounting of what survived the 1921 fire and what was done with it, are not fully available. Some are missing, some were never created, and some exist in fragments that raise more questions than they answer. What can be said with confidence is that the pattern exists. The sequence of losses is documented. The direction of that sequence is consistent. And the questions it raises, about what was in those records, about why the surviving portions were not preserved, about what the broader cluster of disappearing documentation from this period means, do not have answers that the current historical record fully provides. The 1890 census was one document among many that captured America during a specific and unrepeatable moment. Whether its loss and the losses around it reflect the ordinary fragility of historical records or something more deliberate remains, at this point in the investigation, an open question. The loss of a historical record is not always immediately visible in practical terms. Sometimes it takes years, or even decades, before the full consequences of that loss become clear, before researchers and families and institutions begin to understand exactly what they can no longer access and why that absence creates specific, measurable problems. With the 1890 census, that process of understanding has been gradual. The record disappeared in stages, as documented in earlier parts of this investigation, and the consequences of its disappearance have become clearer over time, as more people have attempted to work around the gap and discovered that working around it is not fully possible. The most direct way to understand the practical impact is through numbers. Researchers studying this period have identified approximately 9.2 million foreign-born Americans who were documented in the 1890 census. These were individuals who had been born outside the United States, had arrived in the country at some point before 1890, and were living here when the enumerators came to their doors. The census recorded their presence. It recorded how long they had been in the country. It recorded whether they had begun the naturalization process, whether they had completed it, or whether they were still classified as resident aliens. All of that information was gathered, organized, and placed into the household schedules that made up the 1890 count. And for those 9.2 million people, that federal documentation no longer exists in any recoverable form. What this means in practical terms is that their immigration timelines cannot be verified through federal sources for this period. A researcher trying to establish when a specific individual arrived in the United States, or what their legal status was in 1890, or how long they had been resident before applying for citizenship, cannot use the 1890 census to answer those questions. The information was gathered. It was recorded. It existed in a federal document that covered the entire enumerated population of the country. And it is gone. The researcher is left with whatever alternative sources happen to exist for that specific individual: state records, church documents, local registries, private correspondence, none of which provide the same level of coverage or the same standardized format as a federal census schedule. This is what genealogists describe when they use the term hard wall. It is a specific and technical description of a specific kind of research problem. In genealogical work, gaps are common. Records are incomplete. Documents are difficult to read. Information is sometimes missing from sources that might otherwise contain it. These are normal obstacles, and experienced researchers have developed methods for working around them: cross-referencing sources, triangulating information from multiple partial records, using indirect evidence to establish what direct evidence cannot confirm. A hard wall is different. It is not a gap where records are sparse or difficult. It is a point at which federal documentation simply does not exist. There is nothing to cross-reference. There is no indirect evidence to triangulate. The source that would have provided the information is gone, and no equivalent source covers the same population with the same comprehensiveness. The 20-year gap that the loss of the 1890 census creates is worth examining carefully. The previous surviving federal census is from 1880. The next is from 1900. Between those two dates, 2 decades passed, and those 2 decades were not an ordinary period in American history. They were among the most consequential in the country's demographic development. Immigration did not simply continue during this period, it accelerated. Communities that had been small or scattered in 1880 had grown substantially by 1900. New communities had formed entirely within those 20 years, in industrial cities, in mining towns, in the expanding territories of the West. Families that appear in the 1900 census as established households had arrived, settled, and built their lives during the precise 2 decades that the missing census was supposed to document. And the federal record of that arrival, that settlement, and those lives does not exist. Civil War veterans were another population whose documentation was significantly affected by the loss. By 1890, the war had ended 25 years earlier. The veterans who had survived were aging. Many were in their 50s and 60s. The 1890 census had asked specifically about Civil War service, recording whether individuals had served in the Union or Confederate forces, and this information was gathered at the household level alongside names, ages, and family relationships. For veterans seeking pension benefits, and for families trying to document service records decades later, this information had direct practical value. With the census gone, establishing service records became dependent on whatever military documentation existed, on state-level records, and on the surviving veteran schedules, a separate set of records that had their own preservation problems. The gap in federal documentation created real obstacles for real people with legitimate claims that depended on establishing what the census would have confirmed. The communities that formed and dissolved during this 20-year period present a particular challenge. American movement westward during the 1880s and 1890s was rapid and, in many cases, temporary. Mining camps, agricultural settlements, and railroad towns grew quickly, and sometimes disappeared just as quickly. The people who passed through these places, who lived in them, worked in them, and in some cases died in them, left traces in local records when those records survived. But local records from temporary communities are among the most fragile in the archival ecosystem. They were often kept informally, stored without institutional support, and lost when the communities themselves dissolved. The 1890 census was the one source that would have documented these populations comprehensively and in a standardized format, regardless of whether local records survived. Without it, the people who passed through the transitional communities of this period are among the most difficult to trace in American genealogical and historical research. State records offer a partial alternative. Many states conducted their own census counts in years between the federal decennial counts, and some of these have survived. Iowa, for example, conducted state censuses in years ending in 5, and some of these records are available to researchers. Other states have partial records from the same general period. Church records provide another layer of documentation: birth, marriage, and death records maintained by religious institutions that sometimes capture information about individuals and families that no government source recorded. City directories, which were published commercially in many urban areas, provide lists of residents and their occupations that can help establish presence in a specific location at a specific time. These sources are real and useful. Researchers working in this period rely on them heavily. But this is where it becomes clear that alternatives are not equivalents. State censuses, where they exist, cover only the populations of individual states. They do not provide national coverage. They do not ask the same questions. They do not record immigration status, naturalization progress, or Civil War service in the same standardized way. Church records are available only for people who belong to record-keeping religious institutions and whose records happen to survive. City directories cover urban populations and miss rural ones entirely. Each of these alternative sources has a specific and significant limitation. A portion of the population it does not cover, a category of information it does not record, a geographic area it does not reach. The 1890 census had none of those limitations. It was specifically designed to cover the entire enumerated population of the country, in every location, with a standardized set of questions that provided comparable information regardless of where or how a person was living. The question of what was specifically lost for families of immigrants is worth dwelling on separately. The 1890 census asked immigrants not just where they were born, but how long they had been in the United States. This distinction matters. Knowing that a person was born in Germany, or Ireland, or Italy, or Poland is information that other sources sometimes provide. Knowing how long they had been in the United States in 1890, whether they had arrived recently or had been present for decades, is information that the census was uniquely positioned to provide in a comprehensive and standardized form. For families trying to establish when an ancestor arrived, this information is often the difference between a documented timeline and an estimate. The 1890 census would have provided it for millions of families. It does not. The naturalization records embedded in the census schedules represent a similar category of specific and irreplaceable loss. The 1890 count recorded whether each foreign-born individual had filed first papers for citizenship, had completed the naturalization process, or had taken no steps toward citizenship at all. This information was gathered and organized at the household level, linked to names and family relationships and other identifying details. For families trying to establish the legal history of an ancestor's relationship to the United States, for purposes that range from genealogical documentation to legal proceedings involving citizenship claims, this information was available in the census in a form that no other comprehensive federal source provides for the same period. Its absence creates a specific kind of documentation gap that alternative sources cannot fill in the same way. And this is where the broader observation becomes difficult to set aside. The 1890 census was not a generic historical record. It was specifically the record that documented who was present in America before the documented era of mass immigration began. It recorded the baseline, the population as it existed before Ellis Island opened, before the great wave of arrivals that transformed American demographics in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Every subsequent census documents a population that was already changing. The 1890 census was the last point at which the pre-Ellis Island population was captured comprehensively. It does not fully make sense, when examined from this angle, that this particular record, the one positioned at this specific historical moment, covering this specific population, is the one that cannot be recovered. Other census years have losses of their own. The 1890 records are not alone in being incomplete or damaged, but the losses in other census years are partial. Researchers can often work around them using adjacent records from the same decade. The 1890 gap is different because it is the only federal census between 1880 and 1900, and because the period it covers was not a stable or ordinary decade. It was a decade of maximum demographic change, the peak of a transformation that reshaped who Americans were and where they had come from. Losing the federal record of that specific decade is not equivalent to losing a partial record from a quieter period. The significance of the gap is directly connected to the significance of the period it covers. What researchers are left with is a measurable absence. The 9.2 million foreign-born Americans, the aging veterans, the families of the transitional communities, the immigrants whose naturalization timelines cannot be verified. These are not abstract losses. They are specific populations whose federal documentation does not exist for this period, and the alternative sources, useful as they are, do not cover the same ground with the same comprehensiveness. The hard wall that genealogists describe when they reach 1890 is not a metaphor. It is a description of a specific research reality. The documentation that should exist for this period does not exist, and the questions about why the one record most positioned to provide it was the one that could not be preserved remain, as they have throughout this investigation, without a fully satisfying answer. When examining a historical loss of this scale and significance, there is a point at which the facts themselves stop providing clear answers and interpretation becomes necessary. That point has been reached with the 1890 census. The sequence of events is documented. The timeline is established. The practical consequences are measurable. But what those events mean, why they happened, whether they reflect accident or something more deliberate, and what the full significance of the loss actually is, depends on how the available evidence is read. And on those questions, careful and informed people genuinely disagree. It is worth being clear about what that disagreement looks like. This is not a situation where one side has strong evidence and the other has none. It is not a case where the facts clearly support one interpretation and resistance to that interpretation reflects bias or inattention. The disagreement exists because the evidence is genuinely incomplete. The documents that would resolve the central questions, Internal correspondence, showing exactly what decisions were made and why. Records of who reviewed the census materials, and on what basis. The full accounting of what survived the 1921 fire, and what was done with it afterward, are not fully available. Some are missing. Some were never created. And the fragments that do exist support different readings, depending on which details are given the most weight. The first interpretation, and the one that most institutional historians default to, is that the loss of the 1890 census was the result of accumulated institutional failure. Under this reading, no single actor was responsible. No deliberate decision was made to eliminate the records. What happened instead was a series of ordinary failures, poor storage decisions made by administrators who did not fully appreciate the historical value of what they were managing, inadequate preservation technology in an era before archival science had developed into a professional discipline, bureaucratic delays caused by competing priorities and limited resources, and a government infrastructure that was simply not equipped to protect historical records at the standard that later generations would expect. Each failure was ordinary. Together, they produced an extraordinary loss. This interpretation has genuine support in the historical record. Federal record-keeping in the late 19th and early 20th centuries was genuinely inconsistent and often inadequate. The National Archives did not exist until 1934, the same year the 1890 census records were formally destroyed. Before its establishment, there was no centralized institution responsible for the professional preservation of federal historical materials. Records were kept by the agencies that generated them, in conditions that varied widely, with no standardized system for assessing historical value or ensuring long-term survival. In this context, the loss of the 1890 census can be seen as one consequence among many of a system that was not designed to prevent such losses. That is a reasonable reading, and it should not be dismissed. But this is where it becomes unclear, because the institutional failure explanation, while reasonable in general terms, runs into specific difficulties when examined against particular details of this case. One of those details involves storage. The Commerce Building, where the 1890 census records were kept, also housed other census records from different years. Those records, the population schedules from 1880, from 1870, from earlier decades, were stored in a fireproof vault. The 1890 census records were not. They were stored in a different area of the building, outside the vault, in conditions that were not fireproof. This is a documented fact, and it raises a question that the general institutional failure explanation does not fully address. If the decision about storage reflected ordinary administrative practices of the era, why were other census records given vault protection while the 1890 records were not? Some researchers who have examined this question suggest the answer is straightforward, that the 1890 records were simply the most recent and therefore had not yet been formally designated for archival protection, while older records had been through a longer administrative process that resulted in their placement in secure storage. That explanation is available, but it does not fully match the timeline. The 1890 census was taken in 1890. The fire occurred in 1921. 31 years had passed. The records were not new. They were 3 decades old at the time of the fire, covering a population count that had long since been superseded by subsequent censuses. The argument that they had not yet been processed for archival protection after 31 years is harder to sustain than it might initially appear. The 12 years of formal protests and assurances present a second specific difficulty for the institutional failure interpretation. As examined earlier in this investigation, historians, genealogists, and preservation organizations spent over a decade filing formal petitions, writing letters to government offices, and communicating in documented ways their concern about the condition of the 1890 records. They received assurances in return, formal, written assurances that the records would be protected and that no destruction was planned. If the loss was the result of institutional neglect, driven by a failure to appreciate the record's value, those 12 years of formal communication represent a sustained external effort to supply that appreciation directly to the people responsible, and the assurances given in response to those efforts suggest that the value was at least nominally acknowledged. The gap between acknowledged value and actual preservation outcome is not explained by a simple failure to recognize importance. The internal objection represents a third difficulty. According to documented accounts from this period, at least one person inside the Census Bureau raised a formal objection when the 1890 records were placed on the destruction list in December 1932. That objection was overruled. The identity of the person who objected and the full content of their objection are not completely established in the available record, but the existence of the objection matters. It indicates that the decision to authorize destruction was not made in an environment of uniform agreement. Someone inside the institution responsible for these records recognized a problem with the decision and said so through official channels. That person was overruled, and the destruction proceeded. An institutional failure that includes an internal objection being overruled looks different from one that results simply from inattention or inadequate systems. The second interpretation, that the loss was not accidental but reflected deliberate decision-making at some level, begins from these specific inconsistencies. It does not require a single mastermind or a coordinated conspiracy. It requires only that at certain decision points, choices were made that favored elimination over preservation, and that those choices were made by people who had sufficient information to understand what they were deciding. The storage decision, keeping other census records in the vault while leaving 1890 outside it, could reflect a deliberate choice rather than an administrative oversight. The assurances given to external organizations over 12 years could reflect a strategy of delay, rather than genuine intent to preserve. The overruling of the internal objection could reflect a decision made at a level with authority to override individual concerns. Each of these readings is possible. None of them can be confirmed from the available evidence. But they are not invented. They are alternative interpretations of documented facts. Those who hold this second interpretation also point to the question of who would have had reason to prefer the elimination of the 1890 records over their preservation. This is a question that requires care. It is easy to generate theories about motivation that go beyond what the evidence supports. The more careful version of the question focuses on what the 1890 census documented, and who might have had institutional reasons to find that documentation inconvenient. The records contain detailed information about immigration status, naturalization, and the composition of the pre-Ellis Island population. In the political environment of the 1920s and 1930s, immigration was a deeply contested issue. Legislation restricting immigration had been passed. Questions about who was legally entitled to citizenship and on what basis were actively debated. Whether the detailed records of the 1890 census would have complicated or clarified those debates is a question that cannot be answered, because the records are gone. But the question itself is not unreasonable. The third interpretation approaches the problem from a different angle entirely. It sets aside the question of intent and focuses instead on consequence. Regardless of how the 1890 census was lost, whether through genuine institutional failure, deliberate decision-making, or some combination of the two, the result was a specific and significant gap in verifiable American identity records at a historically critical moment. The pre-Ellis Island population, the naturalization timelines of millions of immigrants, the family structures and household compositions of communities that formed and dissolved during the most significant demographic transformation in American history, all of it absent from a federal record. Whether that absence was convenient for anyone or served any particular interest is a separate question from the fact that the absence exists and has specific, measurable consequences. This third perspective is sometimes described as the most honest available position because it does not require the evidence to support conclusions it cannot actually sustain. It acknowledges that the loss happened, that the consequences are real, and that the full explanation is not available, without committing to either the institutional failure reading or the deliberate elimination reading. Some researchers find this position unsatisfying. They argue that acknowledging uncertainty without pursuing the question of cause is a form of intellectual avoidance, that the specific inconsistencies documented in this case deserve more direct engagement than a general acknowledgement that something went wrong. Others find it the most defensible position precisely because the evidence does not clearly support anything stronger. And this is where the evidence itself becomes part of the story. In a case where the key documents are missing or incomplete, the absence of evidence is not neutral. It is itself a fact that requires explanation. The internal correspondence that would clarify the storage decision does not appear to be fully available. The records of how the Librarian of Congress reviewed the destruction list and reached the conclusion that nothing on it was worth preserving are not comprehensively documented. The full account of the internal objection, who made it, exactly what it said, and how it was formally overruled, exists in fragments. Each of these absences could reflect ordinary archival attrition, or it could reflect something else. The available evidence does not distinguish clearly between those possibilities. What the three interpretations share is a recognition that ordinary explanations do not fully account for what happened. The institutional failure reading requires accepting that 31 years of administrative neglect produced no meaningful intervention despite 12 years of formal protests. The deliberate elimination reading requires accepting that specific decisions were made without leaving a full documentary trail explaining why. The consequence-focused reading requires accepting that a gap of this magnitude and specificity at this historical moment is simply something that happened, without a clear account of how or why. None of these is a comfortable position. All of them leave something unresolved. And the question of which discomfort is most justified by the available evidence is one that researchers continue to disagree about. Not because the question is unimportant, but because the evidence needed to answer it cleanly is no longer fully available, if it ever was. There is a handwritten note. It was found years later, buried inside a Census Bureau file, written in plain language, without any formal heading or explanation. It reads, "Remaining schedules, destroyed by Department of Commerce in 1934. And then, in parentheses, a small addition that changes how the entire sentence reads, not approved by the geographer. That parenthetical detail is easy to overlook. It is small. It sits quietly beside a larger statement about destruction. But what it actually records is something that deserves more attention than it typically receives. Someone inside the system objected, not from outside, not through a public petition or a letter from a historian's organization, but from within the institution itself. That objection was recorded. It was written down and placed into the file. And then it was overruled. The destruction proceeded anyway. That is where the story ends. Not with a dramatic discovery or a clear resolution, but with a note in a file and a decision that was made despite documented internal disagreement. And when the full scale of what was lost is placed beside that note, the weight of the ending becomes difficult to ignore. Out of nearly 63 million documented Americans counted in the 1890 census, 6,160 names survive today. That number is not an estimate. It is a count of what physically remains, fragments from 10 states and the District of Columbia, scattered across records that survived only because they were stored separately from the main collection or because specific circumstances protected them from the sequence of events that eliminated everything else. 6,160 names out of 63 million. That is not a partial record. It is not a damaged archive that can still be used for research. It is, for all practical purposes, an absence, a population that was counted, documented, and then removed from the accessible historical record. And the way that removal happened is not simple. It did not occur through a single event or a single decision. It came through a combination of fire, neglect, and then formal authorization, 3 separate mechanisms, spread across more than 3 decades, each contributing to a loss that by the end had been made official and complete. The 1921 fire damaged a significant portion of the records. The storage conditions before and after the fire reflected choices that left the materials vulnerable. And then, in 1934, the destruction of what remained was formally authorized by the Department of Commerce. Each stage raises its own questions. Together, they form a sequence that is difficult to explain through ordinary institutional history alone. The first question concerns storage. When the 1890 census records were housed in the Commerce Building in Washington, they were not placed in the fireproof vault that existed in that same building. Other census records were. Population schedules from 1880, from 1870, from earlier decades. Those were stored in the vault. The 1890 records were stored in a different area, outside the vault, in conditions that did not offer the same level of protection. This raises questions that the standard explanation does not fully answer. The most common response to this detail is that the 1,890 records were simply the most recent at the time and had not yet gone through the administrative process that resulted in older records being designated for vault storage. That explanation has a certain logic to it, but the timeline does not fully match. The 1890 census was taken in 1890. The fire occurred in 1921. 31 years had passed. These were not newly generated records, sitting in temporary storage while awaiting formal processing. They were 3 decades old, covering a population count that had long since been followed by the 1900 and 1910 censuses. The argument that they were still waiting for archival designation after 31 years is not impossible, but it requires more explanation than it has typically been given. The second question concerns the 12 years of formal requests. Beginning in the early 20th century and continuing up until the destruction itself, historians, genealogists, and preservation organizations submitted formal petitions and wrote documented correspondence to government offices expressing concern about the condition of the 1890 records. This was not a quiet concern expressed informally. It was a sustained, organized, official effort by people who understood the historical value of what was being held. And the government responded to those requests, not with silence, but with assurances, written assurances, formal communications indicating that the records would be protected, that no destruction was planned, that the materials were being properly managed. Those assurances were given over a period of 12 years, and at the end of those 12 years, the records were formally authorized for destruction. It doesn't fully make sense that 12 years of acknowledged importance and formal assurances would lead directly to authorized elimination, but that is what the record shows. The third question concerns timing. The formal authorization for destruction of the remaining 1890 census materials was issued in December 1932, and the destruction itself was carried out in 1934. The National Archives' cornerstone was laid in 1933. The institution that would have been responsible for preserving exactly these kinds of federal historical records was being established at precisely the moment the 1890 records were being removed. Some researchers note this timing as coincidental. Others find it difficult to treat as coincidence. The destruction was authorized the day after the National Archives' cornerstone was laid. Whether that timing reflects poor coordination between different parts of the federal government or something else is a question that does not have a clear answer, but the detail is documented, and it is difficult to simply set aside. The fourth question, and in many ways the most difficult one, concerns the content of what was lost. The 1890 census was taken at a specific and historically significant moment. It captured the American population before Ellis Island opened, which means it documented the composition of communities that formed during an earlier wave of immigration. It recorded immigration status and naturalization timelines with a level of detail that was specific to that census period. It captured family structures, household compositions, and the demographic information of a population that was in the process of defining who was legally and officially American. The records documented who was already in the country, on what legal basis, and with what documentation of their status. In the political environment of the 1920s and 1930s, those questions were not abstract historical matters. They were actively contested. Immigration restriction legislation had been passed. Questions about citizenship eligibility and naturalization status were being debated at a federal level. This raises a question that some researchers have been reluctant to ask directly, whether the specific content of the 1890 census and what it might have confirmed or complicated about those ongoing debates was a factor in the decisions that led to its elimination. That question cannot be answered, but it also cannot be fully dismissed. What is notable about these 4 questions is that they are not questions about the margins of the story. They concern the central events, storage, preservation requests, timing, and content, and none of them have clean, fully documented answers. The internal correspondence that would clarify the storage decision is not comprehensively available. The records of how preservation assurances were formulated and by whom do not appear to be fully documented. The reasoning behind the timing of the destruction authorization is not explained in any source that researchers have been able to locate, and the question of what role, if any, The specific content of the records played in decisions about their fate cannot be evaluated because the content itself no longer exists. Some believe the loss was the result of accumulated institutional failure, poor decisions made by administrators who did not fully understand what they were managing, inadequate preservation systems in an era before archival science had developed professional standards, bureaucratic delays that produced no meaningful intervention despite years of external concern. Under this reading, no one was responsible in a deliberate sense. The system simply failed, as systems in that era often did with historical records of all kinds. Others disagree. They point to the specific inconsistencies, the storage decision, the 12 years of assurances, the timing, the overruled internal objection, and argue that a series of ordinary failures does not adequately explain a pattern of specific choices that consistently favored elimination over preservation. The evidence does not clearly resolve this disagreement, and this is where the explanation becomes difficult, because the documents that would clarify the key decisions, internal communications, administrative reviews, formal records of how specific choices were made, are themselves incomplete or unavailable. In a case involving the destruction of records, the absence of documentation explaining that destruction is not a neutral fact. It is part of the pattern that requires explanation. Whether those explanatory documents were never created, were lost through ordinary archival attrition, or were eliminated along with the census records themselves is something the available evidence cannot establish. But their absence shapes what can and cannot be known about why the 1890 census is gone. The handwritten note, not approved by the geographer, sits in that space between what is documented and what remains unclear. It establishes that the decision was not made with uniform agreement. Someone with professional standing inside the institution reviewed the destruction authorization and found a reason to object. That reason is not fully recorded. The objection was noted in parentheses, and then the process continued without it. That detail sounds minor at first, until it is examined more closely, because an institutional decision that includes an overruled internal objection is different from one made through simple oversight or neglect. It suggests that the decision was made with awareness that not everyone inside the system agreed it was correct, and it was made anyway. The 20-year gap that the 1890 census leaves behind in the American historical record is a specific kind of absence. It is not the absence of records that were never created. It is the absence of records that were created, were maintained for decades, were the subject of sustained preservation efforts, and then were destroyed through a formal process that acknowledged their existence before authorizing their elimination. The gap falls precisely in the period that would document the pre-Ellis Island population, the naturalization status of millions of immigrants, and the demographic composition of American communities at a historically critical moment of transformation. Whether that gap was shaped by deliberate intention or produced by accumulated failure, the consequence is the same. The information is gone. The verification it would have provided is gone, and the questions it might have answered are now questions that cannot be fully resolved. These questions do not have clear answers. The records that might have answered them no longer exist, and the 6,160 names that remain, out of nearly 63 million, are not an archive. They are a remainder, a fragment of documentation that survived a process that eliminated everything else. One shaped, some would say, like something that was meant to disappear. Whether that is the correct reading of what happened is a question the evidence cannot cleanly settle. But it is a question that the evidence does not allow to be fully set aside either. And that, more than any single fact or document or handwritten note, may be the most honest summary of where this investigation ends, not with an answer, but with an absence that continues to ask to be explained.